He thought she was just another maid until she touched something he'd buried deeper than grief. Rain swept across the glass walls of the mansion on Twin Peaks, turning the view of San Francisco into a blur of silver and gray. Inside the lights were dim, the air heavy with quiet. Liam Hale sat alone at the long marble counter, a half-empty glass of whiskey beside his laptop that had been asleep for hours. 2 years had passed since the accident, yet the silence inside this house still felt new every night. He had once been the kind of man who filled rooms with sound laughter and ambition. Now his empire ran without him, and he lived surrounded by ghosts that had no voices. The sea of rain outside mirrored the restlessness inside his chest. He barely noticed the time until a notification from his phone flashed: "New housekeeper arrives at 8 p.m. Liam frowned. He had forgotten about the agency renewal. Every few months they sent someone new because none of them lasted. They all left after realizing what it felt like to work in a house that never spoke back. He pushed away the whiskey glass, exhaled, and stood up. When the doorbell rang, he hesitated for a moment. Through the security camera, he saw a woman in a gray coat, her hair damp from the drizzle, clutching a cleaning tote. She was young, probably late 20s, with tired but determined eyes. The kind of look that came from someone who'd been carrying the weight of life for too long, but hadn't given up yet. Liam pressed the unlock code and opened the door just enough for his voice to reach her. "Kitchen." No need to speak. That was all he said before turning away. She nodded once quietly, stepping inside her shoes, squeaking on the polished floor. The smell of rain followed her in soft but human, a contrast to the sterile, air-conditioned stillness of his home. She moved with care, setting her things down and glancing at the walls, where abstract paintings hung like silent witnesses. He returned to his desk trying to work, but found himself listening instead. The faint rhythm of footsteps, the sound of cloth wiping glass, the small creak of the cabinet door opening. She was careful, not clumsy like most. He hated noise, but there was something different about hers. It sounded alive. Her name, according to the agency file on his tablet, was Elena Cruz, 27, from East Los Angeles. Background check clear. Experience 2 years with private clients. Preferred schedule evenings. He scrolled past the details and closed it. Names did not matter. They came and went like shadows. Still, something about the way she hummed under her breath, barely audible, caught him off guard. He almost said something but stopped. His rules existed for a reason. He could not stand music because the last song he heard had ended with the crash that took Clara. He had not played a note since. Elena finished the kitchen in silence, leaving it cleaner than it had been in months. As she moved through the hall, she paused before a closed door. Behind it was the studio that no one entered. She noticed the thin layer of dust near the handle and the faint outline of piano keys in the photograph on the wall beside it. But she respected boundaries. Without a word, she turned away and continued upstairs. Liam watched her from the reflection in the glass. She worked like someone who understood invisible pain, the kind that required no explanation. For a brief second, he wondered what her story was. He shook his head. He did not need stories. He needed distance. The rain kept falling, blurring the skyline into streaks of light. When she finished, Elena left an envelope on the counter with the invoice neatly written inside. She hesitated before leaving, as if waiting for him to acknowledge her presence. He did not. But when the door clicked shut and her footsteps faded, The house felt even emptier than before. Liam walked to the window and looked at his reflection. He saw the same tired eyes that had stared back for 2 years. Something about tonight unsettled him. He turned toward the counter and saw a small folded napkin she had left by accident. On it was a faint pencil sketch of the view from his window, the city under rain, simple but full of warmth. His fingers brushed the edge of the paper. He exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. He thought she was just another maid, someone who would come and go without leaving a trace. But something about that small drawing felt like a pulse in the middle of his frozen world. Outside, thunder rolled, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir in the quiet. It was not peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of a crack in the glass that had separated him from the world. And through that crack, faint as it was, the light of something new began to bleed in. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving behind the smell of wet asphalt and eucalyptus drifting through the open windows. Liam stood at the kitchen counter with his coffee, the first sound of the day being the distant hum of traffic from the city below. Across the room, Elena was already there, polishing the steel appliances until they gleamed. She had arrived quietly early as always, 3 times a week like clockwork. He didn't remember hiring her again, but she never missed a day. She moved around him with a calm rhythm, never speaking unless necessary. For Liam, silence was safer. Silence didn't ask questions. He had built his world on it, since the night the sirens took everything. The news still had his old photo on some articles, the young billionaire whose wife died in a car crash outside a concert hall he had sponsored. The world called it tragedy. To him it was punishment. Elena did not know any of that, and maybe that was why he tolerated her presence. She treated the house as if it were alive. Every corner she touched seemed to regain a faint trace of warmth. He sometimes caught her pausing before the large windows, watching the fog roll across the bay. Her eyes softened in those moments, filled with a quiet longing that mirrored his own. He told himself he didn't notice, but he did. The silence between them became its own kind of agreement. She would do her work. He would stay in his office. They would pretend not to exist in each other's orbit. Yet the air in the mansion had started to change. He found himself listening for the faint sounds she made, the way the vacuum clicked off the rustle of her clothes, the quiet scrape of her shoes on the marble floor. Small signs of life he hadn't realized he missed. In the evenings when she left, he noticed the scent of lemon and soap lingering behind her. Elna's life outside these walls was a different world. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a bakery in the Mission District, where the walls were thin and laughter traveled easily. Her mother's voice crackled through phone calls each night, full of fatigue and worry. The hospital bills had grown heavier than rent, and Elena took on every extra shift she could find. Cleaning for a man she never spoke to was just another job, except there was something about that house that made her chest tighten. Maybe it was the music room she was told not to enter, or the photo she'd glimpsed once of a woman with dark hair and a soft smile. She could feel the grief clinging to the walls like dust. Every time she wiped a surface, she sensed it pressing back, unyielding. Still she stayed. It was work. She needed the money. She never complained about the quiet or his distance. She understood that kind of silence. One evening when Liam walked through the hall, he saw her kneeling by the stairs, scrubbing a step that was already spotless. He paused. "You missed a spot?" he asked, voice dry. She glanced up, startled by the sudden break of silence, then smiled faintly. "Just making sure it shines," she said, and went back to work. Her accent was soft music, hidden under exhaustion. He turned away before she could see the small twitch of a smile on his lips. Later that night, he found himself staring at the same stair-step, wondering why he cared if it shined. Days turned into weeks. The routine became their shared language. She arrived, worked left, and the world kept turning. But something in him shifted the morning he walked into the kitchen, to find her standing, still gazing at the photograph of Clara on the wall. Her hand hovered over the frame, careful not to touch it. When she realized he was behind her, she froze. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," he interrupted, sharper than he intended. The words hung heavy between them. He saw her eyes flicker, not with fear but empathy. That unsettled him more than pity would have. "You can finish early today," he added. She nodded and left without a sound. After she was gone, he stood before the photo himself, tracing the edge of the frame with his thumb. For the first time, he wondered what Clara would think if she saw him now, half alive, hiding in glass and rain. The next day, Elena returned as usual. She said nothing about the previous night. Instead, she worked faster, her movements brisk but graceful. When she was done, she left a folded note beside the sink. "For cleaning supplies, they're out of stock downtown. I can pick them up cheaper near my place if you want." He read it twice before crumpling it. Though later that week, he saw a fresh box of supplies on the counter. She'd bought them anyway. He didn't know why that small act felt like kindness. That evening, he wrote a check for double her rate and left it under a paperweight. The next morning, it was still there. In its place, she'd left a smaller envelope containing the correct amount and a single sentence on a sticky note. "We agreed on 3 days. That's enough." He sat at the desk staring at her handwriting, simple, round, and unpretentious. For the first time in years, Liam felt a flicker of something that resembled respect, maybe even curiosity. It frightened him. He wasn't ready for curiosity. It meant opening doors he had locked long ago. The silence contract held, but beneath its surface, something was beginning to hum again. Faint, persistent, and alive. The days slipped into rhythm, predictable, but strangely grounding. 3 evenings a week, Elna arrived with her tote bag and her quiet presence, and the mansion felt less like a monument to loss. She learned the pattern of the lights that flickered on at dusk, the faint scent of whiskey that lingered in the study, and the sound of Liam's footsteps pacing the upper floor when he couldn't sleep. She never saw him smile, but sometimes when she left tea, instead of coffee, the cup was empty the next morning. That was enough. Outside, San Francisco turned restless with early winter rain. The wind carried salt from the bay, and the fog swallowed the city lights whole. Outside, silence ruled until one Thursday afternoon, the world tilted. Elena had stayed later than usual, waiting for the storm to ease before catching her bus. The sky was bruised purple when she stepped toward the front door, but before she could leave, the security gate triggered its automatic lockdown. The heavy glass doors sealed, trapping her between the inner and outer frame. A gust of wind slammed against the glass, shaking it hard enough to rattle her breath. "Hello," she called, pressing the intercom. It crackled, but no voice came. The rain thickened, hammering the roof like fists. She pounded the glass again. Inside, Liam was upstairs in his study, When he heard the sound, Sharp panicked. He froze for a heartbeat before instinct shoved him to his feet. The security monitor showed her trapped between the gates, water flooding the threshold. He sprinted down the hallway bare feet, hitting the marble, his pulse louder than the thunder. When he reached the control panel, the digital lock refused to respond. "Damn it!" he muttered, overriding the system manually. The mechanism jammed. Outside, Elena was soaked hair plastered to her cheeks, trembling in the cold. Her breath fogged against the glass. She saw him on the other side, his face pale under the emergency lights. "Don't move," he shouted through the barrier, then yanked a metal release lever hidden beneath the console. The doors hissed open with a metallic groan. Rain burst inside. Without thinking, he grabbed her arm and pulled her through. The moment the glass sealed behind them, the world went still again. For a second, neither spoke. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin. Her eyelashes beaded with water. He shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It hung heavy, smelling faintly of cedar and night. "You could have just pressed unlock," she said softly, voice trembling with a mix of fear and irony. Didn't think he answered, catching his breath. "I just moved." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that felt older than words. For years he had trained himself not to care, to keep distance between himself and anyone who might stir life back into the ruins of his heart. Yet standing there watching the raindrops slide down her neck, he realized he hadn't felt this alive since the world ended. Elna broke the silence first. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her hands were still shaking. He nodded, stepping back, as if distance could restore control. "The system's old," he said quietly. "I'll have it fixed." She smiled faintly. Maybe it just wanted company. He almost laughed but stopped himself. She went to the kitchen, peeling off her gloves and drying her hands. He followed without meaning to leaning against the doorway as she boiled water for tea. The kettle hissed steam curling into the dim air. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice low. "The storm's not safe," she replied. "Neither is walking down that hill in the dark." He didn't argue. Instead, he watched her move with practiced grace. Everything deliberate, nothing wasted. When she handed him a cup of tea, their fingers brushed, and the brief contact sent a spark up his arm. Neither of them looked away this time. Outside, lightning flashed, casting their reflections across the glass walls. For the first time, he didn't see his house as a prison of mirrors. He saw her standing there, small but steady, against the storm, and the image unsettled him. "You should change," he murmured. "There are towels in the guest room." She hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the hall. He stayed where he was, staring into the tea, until the surface stilled. When she returned, wrapped in one of his robes, her hair damp and loose, she looked almost fragile. Yet her eyes held the kind of strength he had forgotten existed. "Better?" he asked. "Warmer," she said, settling across from him at the table. The storm raged on outside, but inside time slowed. He studied her face, memorizing the curve of her mouth, the faint line of worry between her brows. "You're not like the others," he said before he could stop himself. "The others, the ones who came before, they never stayed." She looked at him quietly. Maybe they didn't see what was worth staying for. His throat tightened. He didn't answer. When thunder rolled again, he found himself standing, moving to the window. She joined him there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the rain streak down the glass. For the first time, he let the silence soften instead of suffocate. The storm outside howled, but the one inside his chest had finally found something or someone to anchor to. Neither of them knew it yet, but that night marked the first fracture in his loneliness, the first echo of connection that would soon turn into something he no longer knew how to resist. The storm didn't let up. By midnight, the hill roads were closed, and the mansion stood like an island of glass, surrounded by wind and rain. The power flickered, then died. For a moment, total darkness swallowed the house. Liam found a flashlight in the drawer and handed it to Elena, its narrow beam cutting through the shadows. The sudden silence after the hum of electricity felt heavier than the thunder. "The generator's down again," he said. "I'll check the circuit. You'll drown if you go out there," she said, her tone firm, surprising even herself. He stopped looking at her for a long moment before setting the flashlight down. "Then we wait." The wind slammed against the glass rain, streaking sideways like ribbons of silver. She lit a candle from the emergency box under the sink. The flame trembled, reflecting off the marble counter and the metal edges of the appliances. For the first time, the mansion didn't look sterile. It looked human. She poured hot water from the thermos she had brought earlier, making tea in the dim light. "You don't have to," he murmured. "I know," she said simply, "but it helps." He sat across from her, the candle between them, flickering like a heartbeat. He hadn't been this close to another person in years. Not like this, not when everything was stripped away: titles, wealth control. "You used to play music, didn't you?" she asked softly, her voice careful but curious. His head lifted slightly. "Who told you that?" "No one." "I saw the soundproof room, the piano bench." He hesitated, his throat tight. "My wife played. I built that room for her. She died before she could finish her last song." The words came out dry, almost mechanical, but once spoken, they didn't stop. She called it "The Light Returns." It was supposed to debut the night she... He trailed off, staring at the candle flame as if it could swallow the memory. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. Was she the one in the picture? He nodded. Clara. Even saying her name hurt. She was light. She filled every space until there was no shadow left. And then one day she got on a plane and everything went dark. The storm outside roared a chorus of grief, echoing his tone. Elena wanted to reach out, but didn't. Some pain needed to breathe first before it could be touched. She sipped her tea, letting the warmth steady her. "Do you ever stop missing them?" she asked. He gave a faint, bitter laugh. "You don't. You just learn to live with the echo." The quiet that followed wasn't cold. It was heavy, full of truth. She set her cup down. "I lost my father last year," she said. "He worked construction long hours, always tired. When he got sick, we thought he'd rest and get better. He didn't. The house was too quiet after that. My mother can't sleep unless she hears the TV. Silence feels like death to her." Liam looked up, eyes softening. "And for you?" "For me," she said, meeting his gaze. "It feels like waiting for something that doesn't come back." He studied her face, the shadow of the candle, drawing golden light along her cheekbones. He realized they were two people built from the same material. Grief reshaped into routine silence, polished until it looked like strength. Outside, thunder rolled again, shaking the windows. The power still hadn't returned. "You should stay the night," he said quietly. "The guest room's ready." She hesitated, her hand brushing the edge of the counter. "Are you sure it's safer?" he said. That's all. But they both knew safety wasn't the only reason. She nodded and disappeared down the hallway. He stood alone for a moment, staring at the flame. Then he took the candle and walked to the living room. The piano sat in the corner, its black surface coated in dust. He hadn't touched it in years, but something about the storm about her pressed against his chest like a challenge. He lifted the lid and rested his fingers on the keys. The sound was hesitant, uneven, like a voice learning to speak again. A single note rang out, trembling through the silence. Upstairs, Elena paused as she was folding the blanket. The faint melody reached her through the walls, broken, fragile, but real. She closed her eyes and smiled. He was playing again. Downstairs, Liam stopped mid-chord, his breath unsteady. The house felt alive in a way that frightened him. He left the piano and returned to the kitchen, finding her still awake, sitting by the window. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "The sound of rain keeps me awake. It's too honest." He almost smiled. "You speak like someone who paints." Her lips parted in surprise. "How did you? You left a drawing on a napkin, the skyline in the rain. You see things the way musicians hear them." She blushed faintly. "I used to draw more. Life got in the way. Life gets in the way of everything that matters." He said, his tone softer than he meant it to be. Another flash of lightning lit the sky. She flinched. Without thinking, he reached out and steadied her shoulder. His hand was warm despite the chill. She didn't move away. "You're freezing," he murmured. "You should rest." "You should too," she said. "You look like you haven't in days." He let out a low laugh. "You sound like my assistant used to." She quit. She got tired of my silences. Elena looked at him, her eyes calm and unafraid. "Silence isn't the problem. It's what fills it that matters." That line settled between them like music. The rain softened outside, easing into a gentler rhythm. He left her with the candle and went upstairs. For the first time in years, when he closed his eyes, the dark didn't feel hostile. It felt like rest. In the guest room, Elena sat by the window, watching the reflection of candlelight ripple on the wet glass. She whispered to the storm, "Maybe we both needed the rain." Down the hall, the piano stayed open, a single sheet of music fluttering beside it, the unfinished song called "The Light Returns." The night that had begun as a storm was slowly becoming the night. Everything inside the house began to breathe again. Morning arrived, washed in pale gold, the kind that made the glass walls glow and the air smell clean again. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the silence, in the faint, damp scent that clung to the curtains, in the way Liam's heartbeat still remembered the rhythm of thunder. He came downstairs to find Elena, already awake, barefoot in the kitchen, her hair tied loosely, her sleeves rolled up as she wiped the counters. She looked up startled when he spoke. "You're still here. The buses aren't running yet," she said. "The roads are closed until noon. Then stay." He caught himself, then added, "There's coffee or tea." She smiled faintly. "Coffee's fine." The domestic normalcy of it felt almost absurd. He had not shared a morning like this with anyone since Clara. But there was something different about this silence. It was no longer empty. It hummed. He sat at the counter watching her move. She didn't rush or fidget, just worked with a kind of grace that made the simple act of cleaning look like meditation. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied, "but it feels wrong leaving a mess behind." He studied her. "You're used to taking care of things that aren't yours," she shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I just like making broken things look better." That line stayed with him. As she poured coffee, their hands brushed again, light and unplanned. It wasn't electricity this time, it was recognition. They drank in quiet, watching mist crawl up from the garden. Then faintly the sound came, notes drifting through the air. He turned. Is that Elena froze by the living room doorway? Her fingers were on the piano keys, pressing them gently, almost reverently. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to keep playing," he said before thinking. She blinked. "Really, it's been silent long enough." He leaned against the doorway, arms folded, listening. The melody was hesitant, like someone walking barefoot through memory, but it was the same tune Clara had once played, the one she never finished. The light returns. Yet when Elena played it, it sounded different. Softer, human, less polished but more alive. Something in him cracked open. The house no longer felt haunted. When she stopped, the air was thick with the echo of it. She turned. "I didn't mean to." "No," he said quietly. "You should." He walked closer, stopping beside the piano. Dust still clung to the edges of the lid. "You play well." "I used to a long time ago," she said. "My father taught me. He said music fixes what words can't." He nodded slowly. He was right. She smiled, small but real. "Maybe it's the same with cleaning." "How so you can't fix grief?" she said. "But you can make the space around it a little less heavy." He stared at her, wondering how a stranger could understand what no one else ever had. He didn't reply. He just let the silence settle again, softer now, less cruel. Later, when she gathered her things to leave, he walked her to the door. The rain had stopped, but drops still clung to the branches. "You'll come back Thursday?" he asked. "If you still need me." "I do," he said, and surprised himself with the truth in it. She nodded and smiled. The sound of her footsteps fading down the driveway felt like an unfinished song. Over the next weeks, something changed in the rhythm of their lives. She came 3 times a week, same as before. But now there was conversation fragments at first, then threads that began to weave something tender. He would come down early to find her humming or leave small notes. "Thank you for the flowers. The house smells better." She would reply in kind. "Thank you for the silence. It's a rare thing." One afternoon he came home earlier than expected and found her standing by the window, sketchbook in hand. She was drawing the skyline again, but this time she added something new, a faint reflection of the house behind it. "You draw," he said. She closed the book quickly. "Just for me. May I see?" She hesitated, then handed it over. Her lines were soft but sure, the kind that came from someone who paid attention to light. The sketches were of corners in his house, the hallway, the stairs, the piano bench. Ordinary places turned into poetry. "You see this house differently," he said. "It's not cold to you." "Maybe because I don't see what it lost," she answered. "I see what's still here." The words hit him deeper than she knew. He looked down at the drawing again, then back at her. "Clara would have liked you," he murmured. She liked people who could see things others missed. "I'm not sure I'd like that kind of attention," Elena said, smiling shyly. "Attention isn't bad," he said. "It's how you give it that matters." She met his gaze and didn't look away. For a moment the air between them thickened, filled with all the things they weren't saying. Then the timer on the oven beeped and the spell broke. She laughed softly, and he did too, the sound awkward but warm. That night, after she left, he found her sketchbook still lying on the counter. Inside the last page, she had drawn him not perfectly, but with an honesty that made his chest ache. She had drawn him not as the billionaire the world knew, but as the man sitting alone at a window, half in light, half in shadow. He closed the book gently. and left it on her cleaning cart for her next visit. When she returned and saw it untouched, she smiled. Their connection grew without confession. It was in the coffee cups rinsed and left to dry, side by side in the piano lid, no longer closed in the way he paused before deleting a meeting reminder just to hear her hum one more verse. For the first time since the crash, Liam felt the rhythm of living return, not in grand gestures, but in the smallest, quietest ways. She didn't heal him with pity, nor did she fill his silence with noise. She simply stayed long enough for him to remember what warmth felt like. And in that remembering, the mansion began to shift again. Where grief had lived, something new was taking root, fragile but real. The scandal began on a Sunday morning, the kind that should have been quiet. The fog was thick over Twin Peaks, softening the skyline, and Elena was wiping the window ledge when she heard Liam laugh. It startled her. He never laughed. He had just finished showing her an old music box Clara once collected, its melody tinkling faintly before stopping. "It used to play," he said. "Guess it forgot how." She smiled. Maybe it just needs someone to remind it. He looked at her then longer than he should have, and she felt something in her chest shift. Outside, unnoticed, a telephoto lens watched from the distance. A paparazzi had followed a lead from a disgruntled ex-employee who claimed the billionaire had a secret woman living in his house. The photo he took was quiet but intimate, her hand on his shoulder, his head slightly tilted toward her. His face softened by something dangerously close to peace. By the next morning, the picture was everywhere. Tech mogul and his maid, the billionaire's secret affair, the headline screamed across every gossip site. The articles spun their story like a scandalous novel. How the widowed CEO had replaced his late wife with a maid, half his age. How she was exploiting his grief. How he was paying her in cash under the table. The world didn't see a man healing. It saw a target. Elena found out when she walked into the cafe where she worked mornings. Phones were pointed at her. Whispers followed every step. Her manager pulled her aside, frowning. "Elena, I can't. This is bad for business. I'm sorry." He handed her last paycheck and avoided her eyes. Outside, the air felt heavier. Her phone buzzed endlessly, messages from friends, trolls, strangers, calling her a gold digger, a liar, a homewrecker. She turned it off and took the bus up the hill anyway. She couldn't disappear without seeing him. When she arrived, reporters already crowded the driveway. Microphones flashed, voices shouted her name. "Miss Cruz, how long have you been living with Mr. Yossi? Hale, is it true you're pregnant? Did you blackmail him?" She pushed through trembling until the gate opened and security let her in. Inside, the mansion felt smaller, almost suffocating. Liam stood in the living room phone, pressed to his ear, his voice clipped and cold. "Yes, I saw the photo. I don't care about the stock price. Shut down comments and call PR." When he hung up, he turned, eyes meeting hers. "You shouldn't have come." "I had to," she said. "They're saying things, let them." "Liam, it's destroying you." "No," he said, his tone brittle. "It's destroying you, and I let it happen." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "I should have known better than to think the world would leave me alone long enough to be human." She shook her head, eyes glassy. "This isn't your fault, isn't it?" He gave a bitter laugh. "Every time I try to rebuild something good, I turn it to ashes." "Stop," she whispered. "You're not the man they think you are. You don't know who I am, Elena." "Then show me," she said, tears in her voice. "Don't let them take away what we've found." He turned away, pacing. "They've already taken it. My board wants me to step down temporarily. They think I'm unstable, distracted. My lawyers say paying you through the foundation looks like hush money. She stared at him, the words sinking in like cold rain. So what happens now? You leave, he said quietly. I'll make sure you're protected, compensated. Don't you dare, she snapped. Don't turn what we had into a transaction. Elena, you think this was just pity that I stayed for money? You're wrong. He flinched as if struck. The silence between them cracked open, full of everything they had been too afraid to say. She stepped closer, her voice trembling but fierce. You were the first person who saw me beyond the noise. Don't make me another secret to bury. He looked at her eyes raw. I can't ask you to stay and lose everything. I never asked for everything, she said, just the truth. He hesitated, then said softly, You were the first thing that felt alive again. She wanted to hold on to those words, but they came too late. Outside the cameras flashed like lightning, and inside everything began to collapse. She packed her things that night, slipping out through the service gate to avoid the press. He watched from the upstairs window, his hand pressed to the glass, as her figure disappeared into the fog. By morning, she was gone. The headlines didn't fade, they only evolved. The board suspended him, sponsors withdrew. His name became a spectacle. For the first time since the accident, Liam felt truly broken, not because of loss, but because this time he had chosen to feel, and it had cost them both everything. Elna, meanwhile, retreated to the city, taking a room above her mother's hospital. Bills piled up, and whispers followed her wherever she went. One afternoon, she saw a copy of the magazine with her photo, her hand on his shoulder. A smile she didn't remember giving. Beneath it, the caption read, From Dust to Desire, the Billionaire's New Muse. She turned it over, heart aching. They don't know you, she whispered to the page, then dropped it into the trash. Across the city, Liam sat in the darkened studio. The piano, untouched, the candle from that storm night burned down to wax. He tried to work to rebuild his image, but every note he played sounded hollow. He had thought he could live with silence. He was wrong. Silence without her was no longer peace. It was punishment. Outside San Francisco, carried on unaware that in one house on Twin Peaks, a man and a woman had both lost something priceless, the quiet kind of love that never needed an audience. Months passed like shifting fog, blurring one season into the next. San Francisco moved on as cities always do, but for Liam Hale, time had folded in on itself. The scandal had burned bright and then faded, leaving behind a residue of shame and exhaustion. The board reinstated him quietly. Once public outrage found a new target, but the victory felt hollow. He returned to work to headlines about quarterly profits and innovation, yet every success tasted of ash. The mansion stood quiet again, though not as it had before. There was no peace in its stillness, now only absence. He stopped drinking, stopped answering calls, stopped pretending he was fine. The piano gathered dust until one evening, as the sun bled into the bay, he sat down and lifted the lid. His fingers trembled as he pressed the keys. The first note cracked, hesitant and raw. He hadn't played since the night of the storm. The melody that followed was broken, but it came from somewhere deeper than grief, a confession in sound. He played until his shoulders shook, until the air itself seemed to listen. Across the city, in a small studio apartment above a bakery, Elena painted. Her mother's health had stabilized, though the bills kept them one emergency away from collapse. Still, she painted whenever she could, on canvas, on paper, on anything that could hold color. Her hands smelled of turpentine, her clothes of coffee and rain. The first painting she finished after leaving Liam was of the mansion's windows reflecting both light and storm. She titled it Echo House. It sold for $200 to a stranger online, but what mattered was that it existed. She began teaching art to neighborhood children at a community center. They came with loud laughter and wild colors, and for the first time in months, she laughed too. Yet sometimes when she wiped paint off her fingers, her mind would drift to the way his hands had trembled over the piano, or the way he'd said her name once quietly, like a secret. The connection between them hadn't vanished, it had only changed form. It lived in the air between brush stroke and note. One night as she walked home through drizzle, she passed a cafe where the radio played a song she recognized. It was The Light Returns, the melody she had played that morning months ago. But now it was complete richer, with new chords filling the silence. She froze on the sidewalk, heart hammering. The announcer's voice came through faintly. That was Liam Hale's newest piece, released anonymously on streaming platforms this week. It's dedicated to no one knows, but it's hauntingly beautiful. She stood there until the rain soaked through her coat. He was playing again. That night she painted until dawn. She used the sound of his music as light, turning it into color. The painting that emerged was unlike anything she'd done. Before a silhouette of a man at a piano framed by windows full of golden mist, while outside, a woman's reflection watched from another world. She called it He Plays, She Paints. Meanwhile, Liam began a foundation in Clara's name, the Clara Project for Young Artists Who Couldn't Afford Education. It wasn't redemption, it was an apology. But the first gallery he sponsored featured a collection called Echoes of Light, filled with pieces from independent artists across the city. One submission stopped him cold, a painting titled He Plays, She Paints. The signature at the bottom read Elena Cruz. He stared at it for a long time, fingers tracing her name as if it were a chord. The painting wasn't just art, it was confession. In it, he saw the silence they had shared, the bridge they had built without words. That night, he drove to the bay, parked near the water, and listened to her song on repeat. He imagined her standing by her easel, the same way she used to stand by his piano. And for the first time since she'd left, he smiled not with joy, but with the quiet ache of understanding. They had been two people orbiting grief, and somehow they had learned to orbit each other instead. Neither knew it, but they were healing in parallel lines. He played, she painted. Each sound, each color was a way of reaching across the distance. Months turned into a year. Her art grew in recognition. Small galleries began calling. The community center hung her work in the front hall. When people asked her what inspired her, she never used his name, only said, "Silence can hold love if you listen long enough." Across the city, he gave a rare interview speaking about the foundation. When the reporter asked what his music meant to him now, he paused, then said, "It's a way to speak when words fail. Someone once taught me that silence isn't empty, it's waiting." The article ended with that quote. She read it 3 days later and cried, not out of sadness, but gratitude. Somewhere beneath all the noise of the world, they were still speaking the same language. On weekends when the city slept, Liam sometimes walked to a small park near the Mission District, where street artists displayed their work. He never told her, but he bought every piece signed with her initials if he found them. He kept them in the music room, not as reminders of what was lost, but as proof that healing had a sound and a shape. And though they lived apart, their art kept finding each other like messages carried on the wind. She painted sunlight, he composed rain. Together, unknowingly, they told a story neither could finish alone. One evening, as the sky blushed into orange, Elena stood in her studio, the radio humming with his newest piano piece. The announcer introduced it simply. From the composer known only as Hale, this one's called The Distance. She closed her eyes, listening, her brush hovering over canvas. The melody rose gentle and aching, and she realized what it meant. He was still there, still reaching, still remembering. She dipped her brush into gold paint and whispered to the air, "Then I'll keep answering." And somewhere on Twin Peaks, as he played, the sound seemed to soften, as if it had found its echo again. 2 years after the scandal, San Francisco had learned to forget, but art has a way of remembering. The Hale Foundation's annual exhibition filled a sunlit gallery downtown, drawing critics, artists, and donors beneath chandeliers that looked like captured stars. On one wall hung a collection titled Echoes of Light, curated from artists who had found healing through creation. Among the names on the roster was one that made Liam's pulse stop for half a second. Elena Cruz. He stood still, fingers tightening around the program. He had come only to observe, to quietly support the event his team organized. But the moment he saw her name printed in delicate serif, the air in his lungs changed weight. He didn't ask the curator. He didn't need to. He knew she was there. Across the room, Elena stood beside her paintings, unaware he had arrived. Her hair was shorter now, her clothes simple, her posture calm. Yet the moment he saw her lift her hand to adjust a frame, every memory returned, like a song replayed after silence. The way she used to move, deliberate but soft, the way light seemed to find her first. Her work was breathtaking. One canvas showed a piano in a rain-lit room, another a window open to sea wind. Each piece carried the same tone he remembered from her voice, sincere, unguarded, aching with beauty. The placard beneath read, "Dedicated to those who taught me that love can exist even in silence." He felt something in his chest unclench. She was still speaking, just in color instead of words. When she turned and saw him, her breath caught. For a moment, the crowd, the noise, the world, all of it dissolved. He looked older, leaner, his hair touched with gray, but his eyes, those steady, sorrowful eyes, still held the same gentleness she had once trusted. He approached slowly, hands at his sides as if afraid to break the spell. "You came," she said, her voice barely above the hum of the gallery. "You never really left," he replied. She smiled faintly, not as she used to, but softer, wiser. "You bought my painting, didn't you?" "Which one?" "All of them." He exhaled, caught. "You knew, I always knew," she said. The gallery owner kept saying an anonymous buyer with perfect handwriting. He almost laughed. "I didn't mean to hide. I just didn't want to take anything from you again." "You didn't," she said quietly. "You gave it back. All of it." They stood side by side, looking at the main painting he plays. She paints. Under the gallery light, the brush strokes glimmered faintly with gold. The reflection of a man at a piano and a woman at a window, divided by distance, yet connected through light. "It's yours," she said. "It was always yours." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's ours. You made visible what I could only hear." A pause stretched between them, long enough for the music from the speakers to change. The pianist playing now was him, an unreleased piece called The Return. The melody swelled around them like something alive. Elena looked at him with wet eyes. You finished it, she whispered. The light returns. He nodded. Because of you. She took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the edge of the canvas. Do you still believe in echoes? I do, he said. But now I think they're not just reminders of what's lost. They're proof of what survived. The curator appeared briefly to thank donors, interrupting the moment, but Liam barely heard. His world had narrowed to her, to the color of her dress, against the paintings, to the heartbeat he could almost feel in the space between them. When the speech ended, applause rippled through the room, and he leaned close enough for her to hear only him. Would you walk with me? She hesitated, then nodded. They stepped out into the cool evening. The city lights shimmered on the bay, the same bay that had reflected so much grief, once now glittering like forgiveness. They walked in silence down Market Street until they reached the small park near the waterfront. The wind tugged gently at her scarf. I thought I'd forgotten how to stand beside you, he said. But it feels like no time has passed. It's because we never really stopped talking, she said, just in different languages. He smiled. You always find better words for things I don't understand. That's because you write in music, she said, tilting her head toward him. And I just translate. They stopped near a bench overlooking the water. He looked at her, then truly looked, not with nostalgia, but with the kind of awe reserved for things that endure storms and still bloom. I used to think love was what you say, he murmured. Now I think it's what you stay for. And sometimes she said what you let go of. The wind carried their words away, leaving quiet behind, but it wasn't empty. He reached for her hand, slowly giving her time to pull away if she wished. She didn't. Her fingers fit against his like a memory made real. The contact was steady grounding, and for the first time in years, his body stopped bracing for loss. You once told me silence can hold love, he said. You were right. So were you, she whispered. Love can still speak. Above them, a fairy horn echoed across the bay, long and low, fading into distance. They sat on the bench until the sky dimmed into indigo, neither needing to fill the air with anything more. When they finally stood, he turned to her. There's a new place I'd like you to see, he said. It's by the sea. I've been building something there. Another house, a foundation. For art and healing, children, veterans, anyone who needs to start again. That sounds like you. No, he said softly. It sounds like us. She smiled through tears. Then yes, she whispered. Show me. They walked toward the car as the city lights flickered behind them. The distance that once defined them had vanished, replaced by a quiet belonging. The past hadn't dissolved, but it had softened into something bearable, something beautiful. In the reflection of the car window, they looked almost like the figures in her painting, two souls framed by light, finally standing in the same world again. The sound of waves replaced the sound of rain. The house that once stood alone on Twin Peaks now belonged to memory, while the new building near the coast breathed with life and color. The Hale Foundation for Art and Healing opened its doors on a mild spring morning, the ocean wind fluttering through its open windows. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, where once there had been silence. Liam stood by the entrance, hands in his pockets, watching volunteers hang the last set of paintings along the corridor. Each one told a story of someone who had been broken and brave enough to create again. The sea glimmered beyond the glass, endless and forgiving. They'll arrive soon, Elena said, coming to stand beside him. Her hair was tied loosely, a streak of sunlight warming the side of her face. She wore simple linen paint, smudged faintly on her wrist, from helping set up the art room. "You're nervous," she added. "I don't get nervous," he said, but his voice betrayed a smile. "I get aware. Aware of what?" "That somehow we made it here," he replied. "That this place exists because of something we once thought we'd lost." She turned to him, eyes soft. "We didn't lose it. We just had to find it again in a different shape." The ceremony began with the local children performing a small recital in the courtyard. The piano gleamed in the sun, and when the first notes filled the air, Liam's chest tightened. He remembered the first time Elena had touched those keys in his old house, the way her music had stirred everything he'd buried. Now, hearing others play, he felt none of the old ache, only gratitude. Elena walked through the rooms with him, guiding visitors, explaining the projects they had built together. There was a music studio, an art therapy wing, a garden, facing the ocean where patients could paint or play under open skies. Each space carried both their fingerprints, his precision, her warmth. "You've turned grief into architecture," one journalist said during the interview that afternoon. Liam smiled faintly. "I just followed her brush strokes." The journalist laughed, not realizing he wasn't joking. By evening, the event quieted. The guests left and the foundation returned to calm. They walked together along the wooden deck overlooking the cliffs. Below, the tide rolled in silver and slow. "I used to think the ocean was cruel," Liam said. "It takes without warning, never gives back. And now I think it teaches rhythm. Even when it leaves, it always returns." She nodded. "That's why we built this place by the sea." He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but full of feeling. "You taught me that." She laughed softly. "I didn't teach you, I just stayed long enough for you to hear it." A long silence followed, the comfortable kind that felt like home. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You know I used to hate silence," he said. "It reminded me of what I lost. And now it reminds me of what I found." The sky deepened to amber and then to violet. The sea caught the colors like a mirror. They walked until the last light faded, then returned inside, where the staff had left candles burning in glass holders. One flickered near the piano. She touched the edge of the instrument lightly. "Play something," she said. "For them, not for me." He hesitated. "It's been a long day." "All the more reason," she teased gently. He sat down, pressing a tentative key. The sound drifted through the hall, gentle as breath. Then another and another. Soon the melody grew familiar, warm. "The light returns." She stood nearby, listening, her eyes glistening as the music filled the space they had built. The notes rose and fell, with the rhythm of the tide echoing against the walls like laughter, like life. When he finished, he looked up to find her watching him. "You never stop rewriting it," she said. "It keeps changing." "So do we," he replied. "That's how it stays alive." Later, when the candles burned low, they sat outside again on the steps leading to the sand. The night air smelled of salt and earth. "Do you miss her?" Elena asked quietly. The question free of jealousy, only curiosity. "Every day," he said, "but it doesn't hurt the same way. Missing her feels like breathing now, natural, not painful. And part of that is because of you. Because I painted, because you stayed when you didn't have to." She leaned against his shoulder. "You stayed too, even when it cost you everything." He exhaled, eyes on the horizon. "Maybe that's what love really is, staying. Not forever, just long enough to help each other find the light again." The waves broke softly, applause from the earth itself. They sat there until the stars emerged quiet and infinite. She turned to him. Do you think people can fall in love twice with the same person? He smiled, tracing circles on her hand. I think we never stopped. We just didn't recognize the new versions of ourselves. The wind swept through, carrying faint laughter from the building behind them, where volunteers cleaned up. It sounded like joy, like the kind that doesn't demand attention. They stood and began walking along the shoreline. The sand cooled under their bare feet, the sea brushing against their ankles. He stopped suddenly, pointing toward a group of children releasing lanterns from the deck. Golden lights floated upward, rising into the dark. Look, she whispered. They're flying prayers. No, he said softly. They're echoes. She looked at him, eyes reflecting the glow. Echoes of what? Of everything we thought was gone, but never really was. He slipped an arm around her shoulders, and together they watched the lanterns drift toward the stars. One of them wavered, dipping low before the wind caught it and carried it higher. She smiled. Even the weak ones find their way. Especially the weak ones, he said. They've learned how to hold on. When they returned inside, the foundation was empty, except for the hum of the sea. In the lobby hung a plaque with their names beneath the motto she had written months earlier. Because even in silence, love can still find a way to speak. He traced the engraved words with his fingers. You still believe that more than ever, she said. It's not just about love between two people. It's about anyone who refuses to give up on connection. And if silence returns, he asked, then we listen again, she said. That's where everything begins. They stood there for a long time, the candlelight trembling across the plaque, before she added quietly, You know what I love most about the sea, what it never stops forgiving. He smiled, his hand finding hers. Then we built this place in the right spot. The waves crashed once more, gentle and steady, a lullaby written by the earth itself. Tomorrow there would be more children, more laughter, more stories of people learning to rebuild. But tonight there was only the sound of two hearts that had finally learned to live in rhythm again. She rested her head against him, her voice soft as the tide. You made the echoes sound like music again. No, he whispered, kissing the top of her hair. You did. And outside as dawn began to break across the horizon, the sea shimmered like a promise kept. If this story touched something quiet inside you, maybe it's because love often begins where words end. In a world that teaches us to shout our feelings, sometimes the most powerful proof of love is silence. The kind that listens, that stays, that heals without asking to be seen. We all carry echoes of people who changed us, a voice we still hear when it rains a hand. We can still feel even when it's gone, a melody that reminds us we once believed in softness. Liam and Elena found their way back through silence, and maybe that's what love really is. Two hearts learning how to listen again. If you felt that, take a breath. Think about the people who taught you how to begin again even after everything fell apart. Send them this story. Or send it to yourself as a reminder that healing doesn't come from erasing pain, but from building something gentle in its place. Love doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to make headlines or prove itself in grand gestures. Sometimes it's just the quiet act of staying, of making tea for someone who can't speak yet, of picking up a brush, a piano key, a broken life, and turning it into something beautiful. If this story reminded you that silence can hold love too, share it. Comment where you're watching from. Tell us if you believe in second chances, if you've ever met someone who changed your idea of what it means to be seen. And if you're still waiting for your echo to return, don't lose hope. Somewhere someone is learning your rhythm too. Maybe they're painting, maybe they're playing, maybe they're already on their way. Love always finds a way to speak even when it begins as a whisper. The quiet proof of it is you're still here listening. If this story stayed with you until the end, don't let it fade into the scroll. Take a second right now to tell us what part hit the deepest. Was it when he finally played again, or when she whispered, "You made the echo sound like music"? Your comment might be the one that reminds someone else that they're not alone tonight. We built this channel for people who still believe love can be quiet and still change everything. So tell us where you're watching from. Maybe it's raining outside, maybe you're driving home, maybe you're sitting in silence. That used to hurt, but now feels softer. Write it down. That's how connection begins. If you've ever loved someone in secret or forgiven someone without words, drop "ha" in the comments. That small act keeps this space alive. If you believe healing doesn't always roar, sometimes it hums like a piano or dries like paint, share this story. Somewhere, someone scrolling in the dark needs to hear that love can rebuild what the world breaks. Maybe it's your best friend. Maybe it's you. Hit subscribe if you want more stories that remind you that not every ending is loss. Some endings are just quiet beginnings wearing new names. We're not just telling stories here. We're collecting proof. Proof that kindness still exists, that redemption is real, that hearts still find their way back home. So don't leave without leaving something behind. A word, an emoji, a thought, a memory. Because every comment here becomes part of the next story. Every share becomes a light for someone still waiting in silence. If this one found you at the right time, trust that it's not an accident. The algorithm didn't bring you something deeper, did. And if you're still holding on to a love that hasn't found its way back, yet keep holding on. The tide always returns. Type "I believe" if you still do. It's not just engagement, it's your heartbeat joining ours.